Last week, I had to do the deliberate, most basic Christianity message. To whom and how salvation comes, God's method with man. And I said that was the backdrop, the necessary backdrop, believe it or not, to teach on the 144,000 preachers of righteousness in Revelation and last day events. Now, to some people, that may sound absolutely insane, but the reality is without that foundation, you really can't go anywhere. Part of this is the challenge here. I've got people, as I said, who are so well taught, sitting in front of me and listening to me, that sometimes I feel some of you are impatient. You're impatient because you want to move the thing along, but then there's so many folks that are just listening for the first time who've never even heard a fraction, even just a small percentage of what you've heard. So I have to go back and cover certain things. One of the things that is, again, this is a laying of a foundation to go somewhere, is to clear up the trash that I hear people talking about. Confusion, by the way. There could be no greater Tower of Babel than television with people talking about things they know nothing of, concerning religion, concerning, I hear people talk about Israel and the Jews or the Jewish people, and it's all homogenized. Now, a show of hands here, how many have just heard everything lumped together in one portion? You've been watching, listening. I'm not talking about here. I'm just talking about in general. People, they don't have a clue of the difference between the two. So they just lump it all together. And I'm now wondering, because there were so few hands went up, where have some of you been? But what I intend to do is we're actually kind of go through the Bible today, the whole Bible, and lay a foundation for something that then we can pinpoint certain things that will congeal. So for many of you, this will be a review. For some of you, you'll be hearing this for the first time. But you've heard me say repeatedly that there was no reference to Jews, Jewish, Judah. I don't even know if that's a word. But there was no reference until the kingdoms divided after the death of Solomon in 931 BC. That means up until that time, that term had never been uttered. So when people begin to talk about the Jewish people, if you're talking to Jewish people, and I want to say this at the outset because there'll be people who, when you say the word Jew, they automatically think anti-Semitic. There you go. Wow, okay. So let's just dispel with that, and let's understand that the word Jew, the name Jew, at first, at the very beginning in its use, as I've said, did not appear until after the death of Solomon, David's son. Furthermore, when people like to reach back and they say, well, for example, if you're talking to Jewish people, they'll say Adam and Eve, and then Moses, or Noah, and then Moses, or Abraham, they automatically want to say, well, these were Jews, of course. But there was never such a thing, if we understand. And if we're all reading the same book, we're not talking about reading a book altered by a man named Smith or something. We're talking about this book. And I don't care if you're reading the King James, the NIV, the BLT, or any other book that says it's labeled Holy Bible, the Holy Bible, you're going to find that in the names, when we look at the table of nations, you may find traces of things like Eber in the English, which may be a cognate to Hebrew, or Abiru, wanderer, which, by the way, Abram was called a wanderer as well. But let's kind of get the terms straight here. And people like to talk about specifically Abraham And immediately, as I said, immediately to the Jewish folks, they'll say, well, of course, Abraham was Jewish. If you're talking to, and I've had conversations with folks who, they're Islamic, Muslim, but Islamic, reading the Quran, and they say, well, of course, Father Abram, and he is to them, and they claim him as their own. And to the Christians, we look to Abram, people who understand, hopefully, and read the Bible, and say, Father of many nations. We still claim him. We don't say, well, he's a Jew. We claim him as Father Abraham, which later on the Apostle Paul will pick up in his writings and explain what exactly that means for the Christian. But without a clear understanding of what was promised to first Abram and then to Abraham, there begins this faulty foundation. And I don't really want to do details today. I just want to make some very generic statements and traverse essentially the whole Bible encapsulated to make a point, which then we can go back and we can focus on details at a later time. So, if one is reading the promises made first to Abram and then to Abraham after God changes his name, High Father and then Father of many, God gives a first covenant, and then essentially he reinforces that covenant even after he changed. I love the wisdom of God, because somebody might argue, well, he gave the covenant to Abram, and then he changed his name to Abraham, and he didn't renew the covenant. So God, a little bit more wise than we are, says, okay, I'm going to tell it to you a second time because I changed your name. Not the reason why, but just in case there's some hair splitters out there. If you count from the beginning of God speaking to Abram until the end of the promises given to Abraham, you will find 48, and if you want to split hairs, you could even call it 50, but I found 48 to be certain promises made to him, to Sarah, that encompasses the two of them, that encompasses their seed. 48 of them, which is a staggering amount. And there's one passage. I told you we're going to go through the Bible, so you might as well turn to one portion with me so I can just point something out. If somebody wants to argue this point, you will be able to say it's right there. The first time that God makes a promise such as this is in Genesis 17:4, and I just want you to read with me, and I want to underscore this one thing. The covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. And if you've got a margin, it says multitude of nations, and the Hebrew reads just about the same thing, hence why he receives the name change. And then if you keep reading in that same chapter, in the 16th, 15th, and 16th verse, God said unto Abraham, now his name has been changed, as for Sarai, thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah, which means princess. That's what her new name will be. She got a name change too. And I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. It's right there, a son of her. Not a son of some other loins, somewhere else, which they're going to do anyway, by the way. They've already done it, but of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. So the woman who is Sarai, whose name is changed to princess, will bear nations, and kings will come out of her. If you keep following these, there's also land that is promised, as well as seed. The land, in one of those great passages Dr. Scott taught on abundantly, lift up now thine eyes, and everywhere that you look, to the north, the east, the south, it's all yours. So land was also promised. But the thing that's always missed, and again, this is where I have trouble with those people who either teach the Bible and they do it in such a way where it's skewed, or people who are not reading the Bible. It's very clear here that the promise to Abraham is to be a father of a multitude of nations. And this, by the way, is certain by virtue of, first, not by promise, but by works. We know that Ishmael was produced with the Egyptian servant woman Hagar. We know that. So Abram took it upon himself. He wanted to make good on God's word, but take matters into his own hands, no pun intended, and produced Ishmael and wanted Ishmael to be the promised seed. But God said, no, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to make it happen the way I said it would. Your wife, Sarai, who will now become Sarah, princess, will bring life through her, both her dead womb and your dead body. Mind you, it wasn't so dead because he produced Ishmael. Let's leave that one alone. Don't touch that one. But what is interesting is after Isaac is born, so we have a son that is produced through Hagar, Ishmael, and all of that line, and essentially Ishmael's line, or his, he already becomes alien, if you will, before Isaac is even born, because God said, no, I said I was going to do this way. Now, I want to take a pause here for a second to tell you, this is why I tell you be careful watching those TV programs that are supposedly educational. They will always take out the miraculous. God couldn't have possibly have promised that old Abraham and Sarai would make a child together. That couldn't be possible. So there's always some human explanation. There always has to be some rationalizing. And I've told you, be very careful about those programs because they can do a lot of damage. They plant seeds in people's heads that God somehow needs to manipulate. He just can't do it. He can't speak it, and it is. But here he said how it was going to be. And so we have Abram, having a child with Hagar, taking matters into his own hands, that produces Ishmael with the proclamation, oh, that Ishmael might live. He essentially wants God to take Ishmael as if that's the promised seed, and God says, no, I told you exactly what it will be through you and your wife. That produces Isaac. Then afterwards, Sarah dies, and Abraham will take another wife, Keturah, and out of that wife will produce the Medes and the Midianites and other nationalities. So when you talk about father of many nations, a multitude of people, we are focusing in on the promise to him of thy seed, which is made good in Isaac. But please never forget that Ishmael was produced, and from that other wife, Keturah, other children, Midian, the Medes, etc. So you've got a vast population right there, which makes good, by the way, on his name change. Now, Isaac is born, and Isaac, remember, Isaac is the promised seed. Isaac is born, and after Isaac is born, the famous passage of Genesis 22, where God says, take your son, your only begotten son. Now, to the people who read text out of context, whoa, right? Because he had another son, Ishmael. Go back to the promised seed, Isaac. Ishmael's already been essentially vanquished with Hagar. Bye-bye, right? So take your only begotten son and go and offer him up on this hill where I'll tell you to go. And again, it's only after this event where the Lord sees that Abraham would be obedient to God's word that he says, because you've not withheld your son, your only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in thy seed, remember, thy seed, in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Now, I'm going to ask the question, and it's rhetorical. But actually, you can go search this out, but the population that has been identified as the Jewish population of the earth, even if you added in those that were murdered during the Holocaust and throughout the ages, could never make up, could never be what this is saying about thy seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand of which is upon the seashore. That could never be. It hasn't, and it could never be. But people will read into this and say, well, of course. And so let's start here. We're laying down some information. I told you we're going through the Bible. We now have, if you move into the 24th chapter, Isaac will marry Rebekah. And it says of Rebekah that two nations, that would be in chapter 25, two nations are in thy womb. Two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. The one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And the most bizarre chapter in the Bible, which is carried through the Bible, in the Old Testament multiple times, and even into the New Testament, about Jacob and Esau. And this is what's extremely important. For the first time in this 25th chapter, we have a reference to something called the birthright. Prior to that, there was no reference. There has not been a reference. There's just been a reference to thy seed, the promise given to Abraham, then passed on to Isaac, and now Isaac is having children. And for the first time, we read about this concept of birthright in the 25th chapter of Genesis. Without understanding this and making some distinctions, people will blur these lines all over the place. Now, Esau was the one who essentially fit the category, if you will, to walk around being and he was the birthright holder. He was essentially the firstborn. You can go back and read the birth of the children and their interesting and weird birth. But my point is that what we have here is the first time the mention of birthright, which will become an important piece of information going forward. And this birthright will be usurped, if you will, by Jacob, whose name is Heel-Catcher, whose name will be changed to Israel. And Esau feeds his belly, sells his birthright for a morsel of pottage, whatever that must have been darn good pottage right there. So the first time, just take a look in Genesis 25, 31, 32, 33, and 34. For the first time, Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." Esau said, "Behold, I'm at the point to die. What profit shall this birthright do to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me this day." And he swore unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. And the last part of this is it says, "Thus Esau despised his birthright." So Jacob becomes the holder of the birthright. It now passes on to him. It's his now, even though he usurped it. And the blessing, which he will cheat and disguise himself to be blessed in order to make himself look like Esau, to be blessed by his dad, to walk away with both the birthright and the blessing and go on his way. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out, we've read through these passages before, but it's important to understand that up until this point, everything seems to be homogenized. There is no, and I'm going to reiterate, there is no Jew at this point. So if there's people who just are tuning in and they miss that, it's pretty clear there is no distinction right now. And if there is any type of distinction, it will be those people to whom God is speaking to versus those people whom God is not speaking to. If you want to try and delineate something or define some terminology. Now, what's important is in the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews gives an admonition to not be like that profane person Esau who for a morsel of pottage sold his birthright. We say profane, not discerning spiritual things. And what's so interesting is that now Jacob, in his, and we could take the time, I wish I had the time to read it, but I don't. You do it in your time. Jacob now leaves town, and he's tricked the old man out of getting a blessing. He's got the birthright, and he's on his way. It's an interesting story. Read it in your own time. Jacob then will run away to his uncle's house where he falls in love with or sees a woman that he wants, and the uncle cheats him. He ends up getting the ugly one instead of the one he wants, and he has to work again another 7 years to get the other one. That I don't understand. That's more perplexing than sorting out who is Israel and who is Judah. How could you miss the ugly one, right? Now, Jacob has these 2 wives and a bunch of handmaids. And now, don't go there. People, focus. Lord, have mercy on that one back there that's completely blushing. All right. Produces the house of Israel. I mean, the tribes, everything. They're just, I've told you, they're popping out babies like, there's no tomorrow here. And if you read through in the chapters, you find that there is essentially, as I said, the whole house of Israel, which will be labeled the house of Israel, which is Jacob's new name eventually, Israel. And through these 2 wives and their handmaids, the tribes are produced. And if you follow this, you recognize that what would have been the firstborn of this gaggle of children that is born, the firstborn of these is Reuben. And then Reuben basically loses his ability, his status as receiving the birthright, because the scripture says he defiled his father's bed. And the birthright will get moved on, will get passed on. And it's interesting how if you begin to follow the birthright and the blessings, and you watch what happens, you can follow this train of thought until, and I'm going to jump ahead and I'm going to go back a little bit, until at the time of Joseph, that wonderful story that's told to us about Joseph, who was the favored child of all the children, with his wonderful coat, and the brothers do what they can to get rid of him, including throw him in a ditch and sell him off and bring the coat back that was made by the dad, that wonderful coat, to say something happened. But if you follow that, eventually, when they all come to Joseph in Egypt, because there's a famine in the land, wonderfully woven in there is that eventually the whole family of Jacob, who becomes Israel and his house, go into Egypt and dwell in the land of Goshen, by permission, by the way, of the Pharaoh, because Joseph essentially saved the land and saved the people through his wisdom and through listening to God. And what we have in the opening chapters of Exodus is there rose up a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, did not know what Joseph had done. And hence we have the beginning of what becomes the 400 plus years of bondage of the children of Israel in Egypt, which, by the way, many chapters back in the book of Genesis was foretold to Abram. This is what's going to happen. God said they're going to go in. Remember, I told you I'm going to go forward and backward and do a little maneuvering here. Way back there, God said to the father of none, I'm going to change your name. You're going to be father of many nations, and these are going to go into the land of Egypt. They're going to become slaves. They're going to come out 400 plus years later and be richer and more blessed than ever before. And this is exactly what I've just taken you through to the book of Exodus. And the whole book of Exodus is about the Exodus out of Egypt, that God delivered these just as he said he would through the deliverer that he raised up, Moses. So while they are living as slaves in Egypt, and I want you to kind of get the picture of what I'm driving for. While they are living now, generations have passed, two nations underneath that whole banner, house of Israel, right? These are the children of Israel, are living and working and enslaved in the land of Egypt. So when we talk about the blessings that were bestowed, and you've got to read it in your own time, the blessings that were bestowed, which I really don't have time to get into, but in the final chapters of the book of Genesis, I believe in 48, we've got the blessings that will be essentially meted out, 48 and 49. It is Joseph's two half-Egyptian sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who will essentially take the place of what Reuben might have had. in terms of the blessings and what will be extended. In fact, there's kind of an interesting situation here, which is Joseph wants his oldest child to be blessed first and the youngest to be blessed second, and old Jacob says, that's not the way it's going to be. He's going to do what he needs to do. Kind of interesting. Read it in your own time if you're not familiar with the passage. So these two children are blessed. And then we have the complete blessings now to each and every tribe. What is said, interestingly enough, about the blessings that are being handed out in the 49th chapter, blessings that are essentially blessings, and some are defining who these folks are, to Reuben, to Simeon and Levi, and then to Judah. And it says of Judah that a scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, which probably needs to be translated a little bit better, but let's just stick with the King James right now. And let's just say that what God promised to happen out of one of these tribes, Judah, is to have kingship, ruler, and lawmaking, lawgiver, lawmaking. And the rest of the blessings would go on to Joseph and Joseph's house. So I told you, this is just an overview. We have to go back and perhaps dissect piece by piece, but it's just impossible to give this big picture. Like I told you, the whole Bible is going to be laid out here. To try and distinguish something very carefully. Still until this point, there is no such thing as Jew or Jewish being uttered. And the only way we can understand, I've given you some type of a term, it's the only way we can understand what's going on here is to say after Adam and Eve, after Noah, beginning with Abram and subsequently Abraham, and the promises given to him through his singular seed, which Paul in Romans 9 makes clear what that means. Seed, not seeds, plural, through Isaac. And then we keep going, which now eventually will be Jacob, not Esau. And that strange passage, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, which is also a very bad translation, but essentially you will never read, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Esau, but always I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in Jacob, and through the line of Jacob, and we could talk about all the children, which eventually Jacob becomes Israel, Israel, and his household, the house of Israel, all right, which are the children, and until, let's go all the way to the end, until 931 BC, when Solomon dies, you've got the first use of the word Jew to refer to a specific people. At this point, to refer to a specific people as a distinct group of people, 10 tribes to the north being Israel, eventually, I'll explain, and what will remain, the tribes to the south, which will be Judah. And at the death of Solomon, there is a revolt between Rehoboam, who would have been the successor, and Jeroboam. These two essentially create this disaster, which I'm going to read the passages with you so it's clear. I've at least laid the foundation. But it is after this time, for the first time, that those of the kingdom of Judah will be called Jews, and they weren't really called Jews. That's anglicized, but they will be called, let's do this, we'll write it the way we would read it in Hebrew. Yehuda, Judah, Yehudahites, if you were going to try and anglicize it, is the first time we have that reference, which, by the way, we can read it within the canon itself, never used prior to that time. Now, people will talk about Judah, and subsequently those people referred to as Jews, and Israel, and those subsequently referred to as the house of Israel, sometimes Samaria, sometimes referred to as Ephraim, if I spelt that wrong. And they will homogenize and confuse these people who are, up until a set time, are a united people. Now, when people talk about the promises of God and what will happen at the end, and I want to make sure I'm going to run out of time. When people talk about the promises of God and what will happen at the end, we're talking about the end, the book of Revelation, last days events, failure to even distinguish between house of Israel and the Jews and Judah creates the confusion when people talk about the 144,000 preachers of righteousness and the tribes out of which these will come, and the allotments that are given, land allotments in Ezekiel 48 regarding these tribes, and failure to understand who these people are, and that this group over here that we will talk about in detail, but this group over here that seemingly at some point will disappear, they will go into captivity, Assyrian captivity, they will disappear, and these people here, and the confusion between these two must be distinct, must be understood. Otherwise, I hear people talking about things even in this current stream when they say Zionist conspiracy, or what about the Jews in Israel? And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, wait a minute here. Because here's the deal. Best way to explain this is, what state do we live in? Last time I checked, we live in California. That should make us a part of America, right? And so we're able to write the history of California, and we're able to write the history of America. You could technically write the history and tell the story of the forming of America, and you could potentially say California is so late it's excluded, but you cannot say that all America is California. Does that make sense? Yes. Because it's not. So when I read or I hear people talking about things pertaining to Israel and the mistakes that are being made of identifying people, I think to myself, wow, this is kind of crazy, because this is what produces the idea, and it is an erroneous idea somehow that these people over here, that all Israel is related to Judah. Make the distinction, understand we're talking about separate people. Now I'm going to try and move this thing along so we actually have somewhere, we're going somewhere. I told you there are blessings that are separated, if you will. The thing that will stay with Judah, kingship and lawmaking. These two things will exclusively stay with Judah. All the rest of the stuff will belong to Joseph and the house of Joseph, and we'll call it kind of heaped over here in this pile. All the other, whatever other blessings that weren't pulled in here, and there's really only two that we can look at, kingship and lawmaking. And why is this important? We know that even traveling into the latter part of the Old Testament, we have the first king, Saul, who was appointed by the people, who came out of the tribe of Benjamin, but it was not of God. It was the people saying, give us a king. But the second king, who was the rightful king, came out of the tribe of Judah, that being David and his son, his seed Solomon. And you keep going all the way to Christ, who came out of that line of Judah. And you see that this is what God was saying. And the same thing is established with the law. Don't go back and talk about the 10 Commandments, the law, although that would be an error, again, more homogenization. But think about the concept of when we understand what is involved here, what it represented in Judah, in Jerusalem. Now, all right, here we go. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. And I've already told you they were in bondage, two nations together, if you will. I'm going to jump ahead because I want to talk about Solomon. And I'd like to show, for those people who are not that familiar with where these things occur, they can read them for themselves. But Solomon, let's talk about this. 1 Kings chapter 11. And this is, again, it's super important because failure to grab these concepts and grab hold of them will mean misinterpretation later on down the road. So remember what I said to you about at the death of Solomon. Until this time, There is nobody being referred to as a Jew. Solomon loved many strange women. If you put them all together, between his wives and concubines, about 1,000 women. That's a whole lot of love. And these wives, essentially, they blamed the women. They turned his heart away from serving the Lord. So he began to offer offerings and other things under these other gods. This thing displeased God. And what is said, the Lord was angry with Solomon in verse 9 because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice, and commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he kept not that which the Lord commanded. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, Forasmuch as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. I'm going to take it out of your hand. It'll be torn out of your hand. It'll be torn. Notwithstanding in thy days, I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son, which is exactly what's going to happen. And so we have the death of Solomon, and you can read about that in the latter part of the 11th chapter. But what does happen, and I want you to read this very carefully. A lot of folks miss this. There's a couple of pieces in here that are missed. If you keep reading in this 11th chapter, you're going to read in verse 26, and Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who is not Rehoboam, by the way. Don't confuse the two. That's the thing that I find when I hear people talk about this. They confuse Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite of Zerida, who is actually an Ephraimite, which is important because that puts him essentially to a portion of the northern tribes. Think of it that way. But it's Solomon's servant. There still has been no division yet, but just follow my thinking. It says here, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the king. And this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king. Solomon built Milo, repaired the breaches of the city of David, his father. The man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and Solomon, seeing the young man that he was industrious, made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph. Read these distinctions very carefully. Charge of the house of Joseph. And it came to pass at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him in the way. He'd clad himself in a new garment, and they two were alone in the field. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him. Nice. And he rent it in 12 pieces. New garment, torn in 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, Take thee 10 pieces. For thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 tribes to thee. Look right there. 10 tribes to the north. Israel, sometimes called Samaria, later be called Samaria, sometimes Ephraim. Okay? But he shall have one tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. That being referred to, the one tribe, but technically speaking, will actually have 2.5. If you want to count the Levites and make them one whole one, it'd be 3, but we'll get to that. Because they have forsaken me, worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, Shemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon, have not walked in my ways. He says, this is essentially what's going to happen. Howbeit, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life for David my servant's sake. You see the grace of God, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and I will give unto thee even 10 tribes. So think about this, because the son is not Jeroboam, but Rehoboam. It's Jeroboam who decides, by the way, that he will set up images at Dan and Bethel to stop the people from potentially going too far to the south to where the temple is. Heaven forbid that their hearts should go back to Rehoboam and they should reconnect with him, which led the children of Israel into either further depravity, if you will. But here, if you keep reading in this chapter, you essentially have in the 12th chapter, after the death of Solomon, the revolt of the northern 10 tribes. And what is interesting is that it says, 12th chapter, verse 19, so Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. Here's the first distinction being made. Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. Israel, and I should write this down here as well, so it's part of this equation. Judah, also house of David. Begin to separate these as you go through the book, which later on will have different names attached, but certainly you'll see these as a pattern. Now, Rehoboam, when he was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men, that's in verse 21, which were warriors to fight against the house of Israel. We have the north and the south now fighting. And for the first time here, we are seeing the separation, the division distinctly between these two groups of people. Now, once you can make this crystal clear in your mind that there is a distinction, then everything else becomes a little bit easier to interpret. In fact, as you go through the Bible, you're going to read from the books of Hosea. You're going to read from other books where, for example, Ephraim or Samaria. Why are these references made? You begin to understand what happens here, and you'll see not only is the kingdom split and the 10 to the north and what we'll call 3 to the south, and I'm including Levi as the third wheel, because when Jeroboam set up idols at Dan and Bethel, he also said that the Levites, the priests of God, were not to be used, and he set up other priests. So these Levites essentially are out of luck and are going to be part of the southern portion. They're going to be band together with the southern portion. So back here, I'm reading out of 1 Kings 12, and it says here, with the Rehoboam has come to Jerusalem, assembled with all the house of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men, which were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom again to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, to try and unite the kingdoms. But the word of God came unto Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, Speak unto Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the remnant of the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Ye shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Return every man to his house. And if you want to circle something here, circle this, so that nobody gets in their mind that some man came up with this, for this thing is from me. God says, this is my doing. I said back there, I was going to rend the kingdoms. And I said back there, the 10 to the north and the balance to the south. This thing is from me. It's my doing. They hearken therefore the word of the Lord, return to depart according to the word of the Lord. Now you're going to see, if you follow the line of the kings, Jeroboam, and you can keep following the lines of these kings, will set up, first Jeroboam sets up in Shechem on Mount Ephraim. And if you keep following down, you will follow down to the point where we can establish by the time of the 6th king of Israel to the north. We can list all the kings, you can look them up, but by the time of the 6th king, Omri, these folks being labeled Israel will begin at this point to be referred to also as Samaria. Why? Because Omri sets up, he buys a hill, and he sets up on this hill, which is also going to be referred to as Samaria. So sometimes the people then will be associated, these house of Israel will also be associated with the term Samaria, and later also with the term Ephraim. So the 6th king of this portion, essentially another name change is added. So if you read in Scripture about Samaria, especially in the books of Hosea predominantly, but it occurs elsewhere, in Jeremiah as well, you will find this is the connection. So what's happening here? These name changes, these people, and then all of a sudden, and I have to fast forward here because I now see how time is just disappearing here. I told you, you can look up the kings for yourself because that's something you can find. Let me flip to another page in the Old Testament. Stay where you are for a minute. Let me flip to somewhere else and find a passage that I'd like to read, because there's about 5 or 6 of them that I need to read before we call it a day here. So you leave here going, okay, I now see the method. All right. Please do not turn here. I want you to stay where you were. In Hosea, we have the prophet saying, when I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was discovered and the wickedness of Samaria. I want you to remember this. It's talking about the same people. So when you encounter these 3 names, we're talking about the same people. And what's so interesting is between Hosea and Ezekiel, specifically in Hosea, which I just described, but in Ezekiel will describe Israel and Judah as 2 sisters, looking back when they were still in captivity in Egypt, calling the 2 sisters Aholah and Aholibah, referring to them, and specifically what is to the north, in their whoredoms. And interestingly enough, each passage, it's almost like looking back and unfolding a layer that God saw, how these people thought their sin had not been revealed to God, perhaps, but God was looking back and revealed it to the prophets in the future, looking back saying, oh, no, God saw all of that. And through all of this, even saw the separation of the people before they were even separated. By, I said, the mouth of the prophet Ezekiel, calling these 2 sisters when they were in Egypt, and that means that they were still the house of Israel, not separated. He saw the distinction between the 2. It's almost as if your spiritual eyesight is blurred over, you will not understand that God had separated out a people way back at the beginning, which is why if you try to take the miracle, if you try to take the wisdom of God and the knowledge of God to the minute detail out of the Bible, you have basically, just forget about reading the Bible. Do yourself a favor. I don't even know, if someone says to me, well, you're trying to show what now? I'm trying to show you that God from the very beginning knew these promises given and the division that occurred. I'm not saying everything is wound up. Did God foretell, did God foresee that Jacob would usurp and take from his brother? I don't know. Listen, I don't believe everything's wound up. On the flip side, the prophets are looking back and saying, this is what God said. Equally to the prophet Hosea, he talks about a people whom he's referring to as Jezreel, scattered. Now, people have done this many times, and I've said to the destruction of Scripture, to try and say that the 10 tribes to the north, what is called by most people the lost tribes of Israel, are lost and have never been found, and the only remnant that remains are those Jews from this bottom southern portion. And they completely negate the information, the historical information regarding these 10 tribes to the north, that whether you want to go to cuneiform tablets, for which I have a pretty substantial collection, and documents that basically unfold and tell you a lot about several different kings and the deportation of people who essentially, once they were deported and taken away under Umri and disappear, they will reappear somewhere else as another people. I don't want to get into that today. I just want to say that these people, the prophet Hosea will call Jezreel, scattered. And he'll also say, essentially, go out. I'll never forget this, classic Gene Scott. I remember the day I was sitting in church and he said, look at your neighbor. Who was there that day? Memorable message, right? And if you weren't there, I feel badly for you. It was just classic Dr. Scott referring to what God told the prophet to go out and do. Except he didn't tell you, go marry a whore. He just said, look at your neighbor and say, I'm a whore. Do you remember that? Classic. I remember looking over. I don't want to tell you who was sitting beside me that day, but I just, very crystal clear in my mind. The point I want to make is God said to the prophet essentially, you're going to be me. and you're going to go out and take an unfaithful wife, and you're going to essentially buy her back, take her to yourself, and you're going to have children with her. And these are the children. Not my people, and no mercy. And later on it says, then they will receive mercy, and then they will be my people again. But in the interim of all this, he also talks about the people, Jezreel, scattered. These are these people. These people up here were never Jews. They were never Jews. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care what books you want to read. I don't care what scrolls you want to open up. These people up here were never Jews. Now, it's entirely possible as they became scattered and they became peoples of other lands that magically reappear somewhere else. At the same time they disappear in one place, they reappear somewhere else with pretty much customs, rituals, and traditions that fit the customs, rituals, and traditions that would have been part and parcel of these people, not of these people who practiced at Jerusalem and who were familiar with the sacrifices and the law, but certain traits that would have been unique to these people that went with them as they went. And whether you like it or not, those people were never lost, those tribes to the north. And we talk about the people who will be saved. This is why it all has to come together here. I told you this is kind of like taking a big dump and putting all this information out there. But a dump of paper, folks. A dump of paper. I've told you the wastebasket upside down. You guys are, you're so carnal. And that's why I love you. But I want you to listen carefully to what I'm saying. Because if this is understood, and we understand about the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and these are two separate and distinct, then just indulge me just a little while longer here. I promise I will not go longer than I have to go, but I really do want to read these two passages which will put together. I just referenced the passages out of Ezekiel, Aholah and Aholibah. But I do want to read to you a passage out of Ezekiel 37, because the Lord tells the prophet Ezekiel, by the way, he tells the prophet Ezekiel many things which we'll have to look at for the book of Revelation, but he tells the prophet Ezekiel to go essentially and prophesy in a valley which is full of bones. And the question is asked, can these bones live? Ezekiel 37. And the prophet again is told to prophesy unto the bones. And he's told to tell the bones, hear the word of the Lord. And as this prophecy is coming forth, something else after this occurs. The word of the Lord came again unto me, saying, moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick, write upon it for Judah, and for the children of Israel and his companions, and take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel and his companions. Join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in thine hand. Now, why is this important? Because even here, it's distinct. If you read the rest of the chapter, it's distinct that these until this time, and this is a prophecy, future, not yet happened. But when the house of Israel and the house of Judah are joined back together and restored, this will make way for Gog, in the passage of that chapter that comes after, for Gog and Magog to come down. You know, people talk about Russia and what's going on today in the world with Russia, but before anything can happen with Russia in the end days and final times, something must happen. That is the reunification of the tribes to the north and the tribes to the south, as the prophet described, becoming together in one once more before that other event can take place. And how, tell me, how will this occur? How will these people here, who are scattered throughout the whole face of the earth, these people are everywhere, how will they know who they are? The preachers of righteousness, the 144,000 out of Revelation. Now, is there a chronology? Does it happen exactly like that? I don't think it's chronologically correct, but the thing that is correct is that this event, these people will have to know, and these people will have to know that they have been reunited and they have become as one before other events can happen that bring on essentially the final and ultimate war that will occur. So the relevance of all this is to understand God spoke to two distinct people. He made promises. These promises essentially they were bifurcated while they were in Egypt, but they became completely bifurcated. They became completely separated at the death of Solomon. And God says essentially through his book, through the prophets, at some point, these two will come back together. But if these are scattered everywhere, how will they know? They will have to know that they are part of this equation to come back to be unified. And that's hopefully the beginning of a foundation for some people to stop homogenizing and to recognize that there are events that must happen before, when people talk about, and I've heard a couple of prophecy teachers talk about, oh, you heard about what's happening in Russia right now, and a lot of sword rattling. Well, listen, there may be a lot of sword rattling, and there may be some type of war that's on the horizon. We're not going to argue that. But if God's word is going to come to pass exactly the way God said it was going to come down, there are certain events that must happen to those who will hear and recognize, that will become united, restored, and then this other force, this other driving force, it's a preparation for, we'll call it the great war machine, and the war that's described in the book of Revelation to take place. Now, I think I've laid a good foundation. Some of you may be completely confused. Others may be going, okay, what did she tell me? Well, I'm telling you that God's in control, and the rest of the matter of what he said will become clearer and clearer as I keep now chiseling away at the details, which I think will give clarity. When people say, well, how will we know? How will we know? Well, at least you can know by the few things that are clear that God said must happen before other events can occur. And that is where I hope to pick up next week, Lord willing. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.